The second time the Grangers came to Diagon Alley, Hermione knew exactly where she was going. The first time had been last September, the day after the woman from the school had come to their house and explained, in calm and practical terms, that their daughter was a witch. The three of them had stood at the entrance to the leaky cauldron, looking rather like tourists confronting a monument they hadn't expected to feel so large. Her mother had written everything down in a small notebook. Her father had asked 6 questions before they'd crossed the threshold. Hermione herself had read both of the books they'd given her 3 times through before they stepped into the street, and had known more or less what to expect. But the feeling of it, the almost physical pull of a place that had been waiting for her without knowing her name, had not been in any of the books. A year was a long time. Now she moved through Diagon Alley the way she moved through the school library, with the comfortable authority of someone who had memorized the layout. Her parents trailed behind. "Hermione," her mother said, "could you slow down?" "I am slow," Hermione said, without slowing. It was the 1st of August. They were here for her second set of school robes. She had grown since last September, which seemed faintly unfair, and a new bottle of ink, because she'd finished last year's in March and had been rationing since April. She had a list. She also had a secondary list of things to look at in flourish and blots, which was technically a second list, but she preferred to think of it as supplementary material. The morning heat sat over the cobblestones, carrying that smell she'd first noticed last year. Something warm and faintly smoky that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. She had concluded it was simply what magic smelled like. She couldn't cite a source for this, but she was fairly confident. They were approaching the curve near Madame Malkin's when the crowd shifted. It didn't part, exactly. More that everyone subconsciously adjusted, like water rerouting around stone, to accommodate a figure that was approximately the size of a large stone, and wild-haired, and booming with laughter that seemed to take up additional space around itself. She had read about Rubeus Hagrid, Keeper of Keys and Grounds of Hogwarts. The books had described him as large. This, Hermione now thought, was technically accurate in the same way that saying the ocean was wet was technically accurate, and beside him, attached to a trolley piled with packages, the boy was small. That was the first thing she noticed. Small and thin, in clothes that were not his, the trousers too long, the jumper too broad across the shoulders, a kind of wrong size that didn't happen by accident. He was looking at the shop fronts with an expression Hermione couldn't name at first, and then could. It was the expression of someone trying very hard not to look like they had never seen anything like this before. He had round glasses and jet-black hair that went in several directions at once. He had green eyes, bright in a way that seemed almost emphatic, as though someone had been deliberate about it. He had a scar on his forehead, in the shape of a lightning bolt. Hermione stopped walking. Several people went around her. She had read about this too. She had read the books, and they had described it in different ways. The boy who lived, the child who had survived what no one survived. And over the course of a year, she had formed a particular idea of what that meant. Something larger. Something more. Not a boy in someone else's clothes, looking at shop windows the way someone might look at paintings they weren't sure they were allowed to touch. "Hermione!" Her mother caught up with her. "What is it?" "Nothing," Hermione said. It wasn't nothing. She just didn't know yet how to explain it. She followed without quite deciding to, so that when the boy's trolley caught her ankle outside Madame Malkin's, an accident, the kind that happened in crowded streets, Hermione was close enough for it to be plausible. "Sorry," he said immediately. His voice was careful, the way voices got when someone had learned to apologize before anyone asked. "It's all right," Hermione said. He looked at her. She was already wearing her Hogwarts robes. She'd put them on that morning, partly because they needed to check the fit, and partly because she liked wearing them, which she would not have admitted aloud. He seemed to find this surprising. She said, "You're Harry Potter." It came out more blunt than she'd intended. Harry Potter blinked. Whatever he'd been bracing himself for that morning, this was evidently not it. "Oh," he said. Then, "Yeah." Her parents arrived. Hagrid arrived more literally, descending on them with the warm and considerable force of someone very large who had decided to be welcoming. "Hermione Granger," he boomed, because of course he knew. The school always knew. "Starting this year too? Brilliant. This here's Harry." "I know who he is," Hermione said. Hagrid beamed. Harry looked slightly cornered. Her father had been standing back, doing the thing he always did in the wizarding world, assembling information quietly before asking about it. Because he'd learned that here, if you asked too quickly, you disrupted the process by which things became apparent. He was watching Harry Potter, the clothes, the trolley, the way the boy kept his shoulders slightly inward, a small target posture that her father, who read people the way Hermione read books, had certainly not missed. "Hagrid," her father said, in the tone that made questions sound like statements, "where is Harry's family?" Something moved across Hagrid's face. He was, Hermione thought, constitutionally incapable of dishonesty about the things he cared about. The truth was always very close to the surface with him. "Got an aunt and uncle," he said, "over in Surrey. He's been with them since he was a baby." Her mother's hand found her father's arm, briefly. "And they—" Her mother paused, then reformulated. "Has anyone been looking after him properly?" Hagrid opened his mouth, closed it, looked at Harry, who was looking at the cobblestones. He had the expression of a man who had been asked to be unkind by telling the truth, and was choosing, visibly, slowly, not to lie instead. "He's a good boy," Hagrid said finally. It was, notably, not an answer. The silence her parents could generate was not hostile and not cold, and for that reason somehow more effective than either. Harry was still looking at the cobblestones. He knows exactly what Hagrid isn't saying, Hermione thought. He's been not saying it, too, all his life, to people who didn't notice the difference. "Right," her father said, in the tone that meant he had finished and decided. He put his hands in his pockets and turned to Hermione very ordinarily. "Shall we go on to Ollivander's?" Hermione looked at Harry. Harry looked at Hermione. He didn't look famous. He didn't look like the sum of what the books had described. He looked like someone who had been very careful for a long time not to expect things from strangers, and who was doing that right now, doing it well, except that his hands were very still at his sides, which was the tell, if you knew how to look. "Yes," Hermione said. She stepped forward. After a moment, Harry fell in beside her, and they walked ahead together. And behind them, without any discussion she could hear, her parents and Hagrid began talking in the low, careful voices adults used when they had decided something and were working out how to do it. She didn't ask what they were deciding. Harry walked beside her and didn't speak. He wasn't sure exactly when he'd started walking. It had been more of a gravitational thing. But here he was, going to Ollivander's with a girl who had known his name before he said it, and made nothing particular of this, which was unusual. Behind them the adults were talking, not loudly. The words weren't for him, but the fact of the talking was. Careful, deliberate voices, the kind used when something has been decided and is being worked out. He had spent 10 years learning the difference between adults discussing him and adults deciding something for him. This was the second kind. The girl beside him didn't look back. She walked as though the destination were already settled. For reasons he couldn't name, this made it feel more like it was. Dumbledore had been watching the Granger house for 3 days before he knocked on the door. This was not surveillance, in any sinister sense. He simply found it useful, when approaching a situation he had not anticipated, to understand what he was walking into. A house in an English suburb, brick, tidy, a garden that suggested someone paid consistent attention to it. 2 cars in the drive, lights in the kitchen after 8 o'clock, a girl in an upstairs window, reading, which he had already known to expect, and beside her, sometimes, a boy who did not quite seem to know what to do with having a window. He knocked at 7 on a Tuesday evening. Mr. Granger opened the door. Dumbledore was tall and dressed in robes of deep violet, with a very long silver beard and half-moon spectacles that, in the context of a suburban doorstep, were somewhat difficult to ignore. He had, besides these, a crooked nose and the particular quality of stillness that came from having a great many thoughts and being very practiced at not showing them. He had spent decades cultivating the art of appearing less alarming than he was. He was not certain it had ever fully worked. "Professor Dumbledore," Mr. Granger said, in the tone of a man who had been expecting this and had prepared to be reasonable about it. "Please come in." The Grangers had arranged themselves at their kitchen table with the particular posture of people who have decided not to be frightened and are succeeding through sheer application of will. Mrs. Granger had made tea. The tea was, Dumbledore thought, doing a great deal of structural work in this conversation. He sat. He accepted a cup. He set his hat on the table because he had long since learned that hats made Muggles uneasy for reasons he had never been able to identify. "I owe you both a longer explanation than Hagrid was able to provide," he began. "We got the outline," Mr. Granger said. "We'd like the specifics." Dumbledore appreciated directness. He began with Lily. He explained what her death had created. A charm, a specific and ancient kind of protective magic that had lived in the blood of her nearest living relation, Harry's aunt, Petunia Dursley. So long as Harry could call the place where that blood resided home, the charm held. It had been Dumbledore's reason for placing Harry with the Dursleys, and he said so plainly, because these were people who deserved plainness. It was the most powerful protection available to him, he said, a guarantee for as long as he remained there against the direct threat that had destroyed his family. Against a specific threat, Mrs. Granger said, with careful precision. Yes, not against his aunt's coldness, not against sleeping in a cupboard. The magic does not, he paused, discriminate between types of harm. The silence that followed was not hostile. Dumbledore did not fill it. The charm requires Harry to genuinely consider that house his home, he continued, not merely to reside in it, to feel it as home. In 10 years he never did. The charm has been weakening for some time. By this July, I believe it had already begun to fail. He looked at the table. I had told myself otherwise for longer than I should have. "Why are you telling us this?" Mr. Granger asked, not unkindly. "Because you deserve to understand what you are taking on, and because Harry deserves to have people who understand it." He told them then about the danger at Hogwarts this year, carefully, without more detail than would inform rather than panic. Someone seeking something at the school, a threat that would be present regardless of where Harry spent the summer. He told them this without apology, because they had earned the truth, and because they had already demonstrated they would receive it without flinching. Mrs. Granger set down her cup. "Is he in danger at Hogwarts, no matter where he lives this summer?" "Yes." Mr. Granger looked at his wife. Something passed between them that Dumbledore had observed before in people who had spent many years choosing each other, a decision made in the space between two faces without a word spoken. Then the summer, Mr. Granger said quietly, is the one part we can control. He'll stay. You haven't asked what the danger is, Dumbledore observed. You'd tell us if we needed to know to help him, Mrs. Granger said. Would we? He considered her for a moment. She had the quality, he thought, of someone who asked exactly as many questions as were necessary and no more. Not yet, he said. She nodded. Then we'll wait. He asked to speak to Harry alone. They showed him to the kitchen, where Harry Potter had been sitting at the table with a glass of water and a great deal of patience for a boy who had been told very little about the last 6 days. The room was warm and the kind of clean that came from people who cooked in it regularly. Harry was sitting with his hands flat on the table, a posture Dumbledore had seen before in people who had learned to take up as little space as possible. Harry looked up when Dumbledore came in. Dumbledore settled himself across the table, folded his hands, and looked at the boy who had Lily's eyes and James's everything else, and who had, from what the last 6 days suggested, not yet unpacked a single thing from his trunk. You haven't opened it, Dumbledore said. Harry was quiet for a moment. I didn't know if I was staying. Then I should be direct. Dumbledore removed his spectacles, polished them with a corner of his robe, and replaced them. Mr. and Mrs. Granger have offered to be your legal guardians, fully and permanently. They have asked for nothing in return. Harry looked at the table. I want to explain why the protection that once covered you no longer depends on your aunt's house, Dumbledore said. And he did, simply without the softening that sometimes became its own kind of condescension. He said, Lily's sacrifice, Petunia's blood, the charm and what it had required of Harry's subjective sense of belonging, and why it had been failing. He said, as plainly as he knew how, the love in that magic was never in the house. It was always in him. Harry listened without interrupting. He had, Dumbledore thought, a particular quality of attention, as though he had learned early that information was something you collected carefully, because you couldn't always ask for it twice. There are dangers ahead, Dumbledore said. I will not pretend otherwise. What I am asking you now is simpler than that. Are you willing to stay here? It was, Dumbledore suspected, a question Harry had never been asked about any house he had lived in. He was quiet for a long time. Dumbledore waited. Through the wall he could hear the Grangers talking quietly to each other, and somewhere above the sound of a page turning. What would I call them? Harry asked. Mr. and Mrs. Granger, or that, Dumbledore said, is entirely between you and them. There is no requirement. Take whatever time you need. Harry nodded slowly. Then, does Hermione know I might be staying? Dumbledore felt the particular warmth that appeared in him sometimes, unexpectedly, in moments that asked very little of him and gave a great deal. I believe, he said. She has had a strong suspicion since yesterday. The kitchen door opened. Hermione Granger stood in the doorway, still carrying the book from upstairs, wearing the expression of someone who had arrived at a practical conclusion and was now acting on it. I thought, she said, looking at Harry, you might want help unpacking. Dumbledore rose, said good evening, collected his hat, and let himself out through the front door. He stood for a moment in the August garden, looking at nothing in particular. He thought about what he had told the Grangers, and what he had not yet told them. He thought about the year ahead, and the danger at Hogwarts that he had not yet found a way to fully prevent. He thought about a boy who had just asked what to call the people who were choosing him, and the very particular quality of hope in that question, tentative, quiet, held close, as though it might startle and run. He thought, perhaps some things could be allowed to go right, for a while, before they had to go wrong. He had been wrong about what Harry needed for long enough. It seemed a reasonable time to try being right about something. He set his hat on his head and walked away down the street. The bedroom had a door that locked from the inside. Harry had checked this on the first night, in the same quiet, systematic way he checked things that mattered, pressing the button in the knob, testing the catch, confirming that the sound of footsteps in the hall did not produce the usual reaction in his chest. It didn't. He went to sleep at 10 and woke at 7 and lay in the dark for a moment, not understanding what was different, and then understood. No one had come in. By the third day, he had started leaving the door unlocked during the afternoon. The room had a window that faced the garden, a wardrobe, a bookshelf that was empty and waiting, and a desk. He didn't use the desk. He wasn't sure he was supposed to. Hermione told him, at the end of his first week, while he was sitting on the floor doing nothing in particular, that desks were for using. "I know that," Harry said. "Then use it." "I don't have anything to use it for." Hermione considered this briefly, in the way that she considered things that had an obvious answer. "I could lend you some of the reading," she said. "You're going to be behind. We haven't started school. That's why you're going to be behind." She produced, the next morning, a list. The list had sections. The sections had subsections. Harry looked at it for a long time, without speaking, because what he was thinking was that no one had ever made a list specifically to help him before, and he wasn't entirely sure what to do with that. The week that followed was not studying in the bruising, mandatory way school could be. It was more that Hermione was explaining things she found genuinely interesting, and he was finding, to his moderate surprise, that the things were interesting. The history of the wizarding world, how spells were constructed, why the wood of a wand mattered, and whether the core was feather or heartstring or hair. He had spent 10 years being informed, in one way or another, that he was nothing particular, and here was an entire world that appeared to disagree. He had been kept back from things in the slow, wearing way of small deprivations. Petunia had once cut his hair so short, after it grew back overnight, that he had looked like something had happened to him. He had worn Dudley's cast-offs until they were grey. He had been told, in 100 variations, that there was no point. He had come to believe it, mostly. He took the list. "Right," he said. Hermione smiled. Not often, but when she did, it was the kind that seemed slightly surprised to find itself there. The accidental magic happened on a Wednesday, his second week. He was reaching for his glass of water and thinking, in an absent way, that it was too far without moving, and then the glass slid 4 inches to the right. He froze. He looked at his hand, which had not moved. Mr. Granger put down his newspaper. "Does that happen often?" he asked, in the tone of a man collecting information he has not yet decided what to do with. Harry thought about the school roof, the jumper, the zoo. "Yes," he said, "fairly often." Mr. Granger looked at him over the top of his newspaper. "Good to know," he said, and went back to reading. Harry looked at the glass. He looked at Mr. Granger, who was reading the sports section, and had apparently filed accidental glass sliding under items that required acknowledgement, but not alarm. He put this somewhere he could think about it later. He was collecting things to think about later. The argument with Hermione happened on a Saturday. She had produced a timetable, not just a list but a timetable with time slots, and Harry had pointed out, reasonably, that it was not September yet. "August is precisely when you should start," Hermione said. "August is when you're not supposed to have to. You're 4 weeks behind everyone who received their letters when they were supposed to. I'm 4 weeks behind you. The other first years got their letters in July, same as me." This was accurate. Hermione's expression acknowledged this while declining to be influenced by it. They went around twice more before Mrs. Granger appeared in the kitchen doorway, looked at them both with the unhurried patience of someone who had been listening from the next room and had made a decision, and set a plate of sandwiches on the table between them. "Eat something," she said. Harry reached for a sandwich. After a moment, so did Hermione. "Tomorrow," Hermione said. "Fine," Harry said. At the Dursleys, arguments had not ended with sandwiches. They had ended with whatever the argument had been used as a justification for. He was beginning to understand that this was not how arguments had to work, that they could simply stop and be done and not leave anything behind. This seemed, to the part of him that kept careful account of such things, almost unreasonably good. One evening late in August, Hermione showed him some of what she'd been practicing over the past year. They were in the sitting room after dinner. She had her wand out, an ordinary-looking thing, vine wood, which she handled with the particular ease of someone who had been handling it long enough for it to feel familiar. She wasn't showing off. She was doing it the way she did most things, methodically, as though the activity had been on her list, and she was completing it. Harry watched with the kind of attention he had historically reserved for watching people who might become dangerous, the full concentration kind, where you noticed everything and showed nothing. It had been the wrong application here, but the attention itself was useful, and what it showed him was this. She did not look like someone who wondered if she was allowed to do the thing she was doing. He had never seen that before. He had never considered it was something a person could look like. "Your turn," she said. He took out his wand, holly and phoenix feather, 11 inches, supple, matched to him at Ollivander's on the morning of the 1st of August. He tried what she had shown him. He got it wrong. She corrected him without comment, and he tried again, and then again. And on the 4th attempt, something shifted. Not the spell exactly, but the beginning of the feeling of the spell, a warmth that moved up his forearm and made the wand tip glow faintly for a moment before it stopped. "Good," Hermione said. It was not effusive. In the context of Hermione, he was coming to understand, it was considerable. They were still at it when her parents went to bed. The night before King's Cross, Harry sat on the stairs. The Granger stairs, carpeted, narrow, with a 4th step that creaked on the left side if you weren't careful. He had learned this by accident, and then confirmed it until he was certain, because knowing which stairs creaked was a thing he understood how to do. Hermione found him there. She sat down beside him without asking why. There had been a family before this one. He knew this now in a way he hadn't, before Hagrid. A father and a mother. People who had chosen each other and then chosen him, and then lost the right to keep him. He thought about them sometimes in the sideways way of thinking about things you didn't have words for. Not grief for exactly, because you couldn't grieve what you'd never known. Something else. The place where something had been before you were old enough to notice it was missing. He had a trunk, packed and waiting by the door. He had a wand in his pocket. He had 4 weeks of something he didn't have a name for yet, something that was in the unlocked door, and the sliding glass and the plate of sandwiches, and the list with the subsections. He was not going to Hogwarts alone. "Nervous?" Hermione asked. "No," Harry said. She didn't push it. They sat there while the house went quiet around them, and it was the particular quiet of a place where someone had left a light on for you. And Harry thought, I have been alone, in some important sense, for as long as I can remember. He held that thought, and then set it down, because it was no longer entirely true. The barrier between platforms 9 and 10 looked like a solid brick pillar. Harry had been in the wizarding world for a month. He had learned, in that time, to treat ordinary-looking things with reasonable skepticism. He watched Hermione walk through the pillar without breaking stride, and followed before the doubt could catch him. King's Cross vanished. Platform 9 3/4 opened in front of him. The Hogwarts Express was scarlet and enormous and steaming, and the air around it smelled of coal and something that had no name yet. The particular aliveness of a great deal of magic in one place. Students were moving in every direction with trunks and owls and cats that looked extremely unhappy about the whole business. Harry stood still for a moment and took all of it in, and then Hermione appeared at his elbow and told him they should find a compartment before they were gone. The Grangers caught up. They loaded the trunks. They said goodbye on the platform with the compressed efficiency of people who know a train is leaving. Mrs. Granger hugged Hermione first, properly, unhurried. Then she turned to Harry. He had been working on this. 4 weeks of practice at not going rigid when people he trusted tried to touch him, with mixed results. He stood still for 1 second, and then, with effort, let himself be still rather than braced, and felt the warmth of her, and the fact that no one had ever done this at a train station before. She said, "We'll see you at Christmas." He said, "Yes," and meant something larger. Mr. Granger held out his hand. Harry shook it. Mr. Granger looked at both of them and said, "Keep an eye out for each other." They said they would. They meant it differently, and both were right. They found a compartment with space for 2. Hermione sat down and opened a book, not one of the required texts, Harry noticed, but something additional. The cat regarded them from inside its basket with the settled disdain of an animal that holds everyone responsible for its circumstances. A boy appeared in the doorway. Red hair, freckles, blue eyes, a robe that was slightly too short at the wrists. He looked up and down the corridor. "Would it be all right?" "Yes," Hermione said, without looking up. Harry gestured at the opposite seats. The boy sat. His name was Ron Weasley. He established this and several other things within the first few minutes. 5 brothers, 1 younger sister not yet at Hogwarts, a working knowledge of everything publicly known about Harry Potter, delivered with the forthright energy of someone who has decided that the best approach to an unusual situation is simply to address it directly. "You're Harry Potter," he said. "Yes," Harry said. "The scar and everything?" "Yes," Ron nodded, processing this with honest effort. Then, "What's it like? Knowing, I mean." "Mostly I try not to think about it," Harry said. Ron accepted this. He moved on. Harry, who was accustomed to people either pushing harder for more or constructing elaborate sympathy around the fact, found this almost startlingly good. They talked about other things. The houses, the classes, the teachers Ron's older brothers had opinions about. Fred and George had told him transfiguration was not to be underestimated, which Hermione confirmed from her reading. Percy had told him that Professor Snape was someone you wanted to impress in the first lesson, and Ron and Harry exchanged a look without quite knowing why, the specific shorthand of 2 people who have arrived at the same reservation without discussing it. They reached an accommodation by the time the train crossed into Scotland. Ron and Hermione established early that they were going to argue about the correct way to approach studying, and then established without saying so that they found arguing with each other interesting. Harry sat between them and thought, this is what it looks like when people meet each other for the first time on their own terms. He had not had that before. He was watching it the way you watch something you are still learning to name. The castle appeared across the water as though it had always been there, which it had. Towers and turrets against the dark sky, lights in the high windows, the black lake reflecting it back double. Harry heard someone behind him make a sound that wasn't words. Hagrid's voice filled the path. "No more'n 4 to a boat." Harry and Hermione got in with Ron and Neville Longbottom, round-faced, slightly anxious, who had been waved forward by Hagrid and been grateful for the specific mercy of available seats. The boats moved without oars. The castle grew. Harry said nothing. Hermione said nothing either, which was not silence in the way he'd known silence to be, but something closer to attention, the two of them watching the same thing in the same way. And this seemed right. The great hall was larger than he had expected, and lit by candles that floated without any visible means of doing so, and the ceiling was the night sky. Not painted, or it seemed like more than painted, clouds and stars and the dark of a Scottish September, above 4 long house tables, and a high table where the teachers sat. Harry looked up and did not look away for a while. A woman in dark green robes stood at the front with a scroll. Her bearing was that of someone who has spent decades being the most competent person in any given room and no longer finds this notable. Beside her, on a stool, a tattered hat with a split along the brim. The brim opened. The hat sang, a long, wandering account of 4 houses and 4 sets of qualities, and 1,000 years of fitting children into one or another of them. When it finished, the hall was briefly, wholly quiet. Granger Hermione. She walked to the stool with her chin set. The hat descended over her eyes. 30 seconds. The brim opened. Gryffindor! The left-hand table erupted. Hermione took off the hat and walked to take her seat, and Harry watched her go and thought, good, and then thought nothing else for several minutes while the sorting continued, letter by letter. Potter. Harry. The hall stopped talking in the particular way that many people going silent at once sounds like a single held breath. Harry walked to the stool. He sat. The hat fell over his eyes, and the world went dark. A voice, very close. Well, this is unexpected. Harry waited. You have ambition, the hat said. Considerable, in fact. The kind that has been building under pressure for a long time without a direction to go. And resourcefulness. I could put you somewhere that would know exactly what to do with both. Harry thought about the word Slytherin. He knew what it meant. He didn't ask out loud. He thought, with everything he had, about the Granger stairs 2 nights ago, and a door that locked from the inside, and someone sitting beside him without asking why he was there, and the idea, still new enough to feel fragile, that he was the kind of person people looked for when they noticed he was gone. The hat was quiet for a long moment. Gryffindor. Harry removed the hat and walked to the red and gold table. Hermione was a few seats down. She turned when he sat and gave him one brief nod, which in her economy of expression meant something considerably more than it looked like. Ron was sorted a few names later. He came to the Gryffindor table with the untroubled ease of someone who had never seriously considered any other outcome. Harry sat at the Gryffindor table and looked at the enchanted ceiling and thought, this is the start. He was not alone at the start of it. He was still working out what that meant, but he understood already that it would change most of the rest of what happened next. The first lesson of the year was transfiguration, and it began with a cat. Not a cat, as it turned out. A tabby-marked professor in dark green robes who had been sitting on the desk at the front of the classroom with the particular immobility of an animal at rest. When the last of the first years had filed in and found their seats and stopped whispering, she transformed. The pop and shift of it, the robes appearing where there had been markings, the woman where there had been a cat, happened so quickly and so completely that Harry simply stared for a moment, and was not embarrassed to, because the boy to his left was doing exactly the same. That, she said, in a voice with an edge precise enough to cut glass, is transfiguration, and it is among the most difficult and dangerous branches of magic you will study here. Anyone who attempts to be silly in this classroom will be sent to the hospital wing. I trust I have made myself clear." The room was very clear. She set them to transforming matches into needles. Ron's first attempt produced a match that turned slightly silver and emitted a small puff of smoke. Harry's match developed a pointed end, not a needle, but the beginning of one. Hermione's needle was perfect. She set it down without ceremony and waited for the next instruction. Harry caught Ron's eye across the table. The look they exchanged had, in 4 days, already developed its own vocabulary. This one meant, yes, obviously, yes, always. We had better get used to it. He was not the worst student in the room. He held this thought with a careful attention, testing its edges. For as long as he could remember, he had been told, in the indefinite way that things were told to him at the Dursleys, that he was not clever. He looked at his pointed match and thought, "This is mine. Not a trick, a thing I did." Potions was Thursday. The dungeon was colder than the rest of the castle, deliberately so, Harry suspected, and smelled of things he couldn't name, but that suggested every bad decision anyone had ever made with a cauldron. He sat next to Ron. Hermione sat to his other side. Neville Longbottom, who had already found his way into the edges of their orbit by virtue of sitting near them at meals and being helped with his transfiguration notes 3 times in 4 days, sat across. The door opened without a sound. The man who came through it was not someone who made an entrance. He simply appeared, which was somehow worse. Black robes, black eyes that moved across the room with the evaluating patience of someone taking inventory. Black hair that fell to his shoulders and was not, Harry noted, the fashionable kind of black. His skin was sallow, his nose hooked, and he moved without appearing to move, as though each position he occupied had been inevitable. He said nothing. He went to the front of the room and looked at them. "There will be no foolish wand-waving or silly incantations in this class," he said. His voice was very quiet. It was the kind of quiet that a room went still to hear. "As such, I don't expect many of you to appreciate the subtle science and exact art that is potion-making." He began calling roll in the same voice. Harry stopped paying attention to the names and started paying attention to the way Snape said them, the flat precision of each, no inflection, purely functional. Crabbe, Finch-Fletchley, Finnegan, Granger, Hermione, Granger, Harry. He stopped. It was not a long pause. Perhaps 2 seconds. 3. He looked at the register. He looked at the class. At Harry specifically, Harry understood, though Snape's expression did not change. "Granger," he said, as though the word required no particular explanation. Harry said, "Here." No one in the room missed the pause. Hermione beside him did not move. Ron behind him breathed slightly more slowly, which Harry had come to recognize as Ron noticing something. Snape resumed roll. He reached the end without further stops. Then, "Mr. Granger, tell me, what would I get if I added powdered root of asphodel to an infusion of wormwood?" A sleeping potion. Harry had read about this. Hermione had made sure he'd read about this. But a sleeping potion and the specific name for it were, in this moment, not arriving in the same location. "I don't know," he said. Hermione's hand went up. It was not acknowledged. "Let's try again. Where would you look if I told you to find me a bezoar?" Harry knew this one. "A goat's stomach," he said. "It cures most poisons." Snape's expression suggested this was neither adequate nor inadequate. It was simply information he had collected. "And what," he said, "is the difference between monkshood and wolfsbane?" "They're the same plant," Harry said, "also called aconite." Another pause, shorter. different in quality from the first. Hermione's hand was still up. Snape looked at her for a moment, and then looked away. "A point for getting as far as you did," he said, to the room rather than to Harry. 5 points from Gryffindor for the first answer. After class, Hermione corrected Harry on everything he hadn't known, quickly and without mercy, which was exactly what he needed. She told him what the sleeping potion was called. She told him 3 other uses for asphodel. She told him that the first question had been a trick because the correct answer was a draught of living death, and the specific name mattered, and he needed to retain it. Ron, who had answered nothing correctly, asked if she could help him too. She said yes, already moving toward the next thing, and Ron looked at Harry with the expression of a man who has just asked a library to help him study and has not yet appreciated the scope of what this means. The flying lesson happened on a Thursday afternoon in the second week, and Harry had never been on a broomstick, and within 3 minutes of the lesson he understood why. The moment his broom rose at his command, the world rearranged itself. He had not known there was a version of him that understood 3-dimensional space the way other people understood walking. But there it was. He went up and turned and tilted and came down and went up again. And none of it was effort. It was the opposite of effort, the opposite of the translation problem that most skills required. His body simply knew. The flying instructor looked at him for a long moment and told him to stay after. McGonagall arrived later that afternoon. She told him he was the new Gryffindor seeker. Youngest in a century. Hermione, when informed, said that Quidditch practice schedules were going to be an issue for the study plan. Ron, when informed, looked at Harry with uncomplicated joy and said, "Mate, you have to tell me everything." Harry walked back from Quidditch practice 3 weeks later and passed the corridor outside the Dada classroom, and his scar hurt. Not metaphorically. A sharp, specific pain at the lightning bolt mark, as though something had pressed against it from the inside. The Dada classroom door was closed. He stood until the pain faded, then walked on. He did not tell Hermione. He could not yet describe the specific quality of it. Sharp, foreign, like pressure from the wrong direction. He filed it somewhere that was not quite worry, in the way he had filed things his whole life. He was good at filing things. He was beginning to suspect that this was not as useful a skill as he had always assumed. Neville Longbottom melted 3 cauldrons in potions by the end of October, which was, Harry gathered from the other students' reactions, not quite a record, but close to one. Snape docked 10 points from Gryffindor on each occasion, while looking at Harry in the specific way that suggested Harry was responsible without being directly accused of anything. Harry helped Neville up when he tripped on the same step outside the potions dungeon twice in the same week, because it was the obvious thing to do. Hermione took Neville's potions notes and annotated them with corrections in a different coloured ink, organised by error type. Ron told Neville, with genuine sympathy, that Snape had it in for all of them, but especially Harry, and this seemed to help Neville slightly more than the annotated notes did, though both were needed. Hermione disagreed with this characterization of Snape's motivation. Harry thought she was probably right and was also missing the point, which was that Neville needed to feel less alone in it. He did not say this. Hermione would arrive at the same conclusion herself. He was beginning to know her, specifically, the rhythm of how she thought, the difference between her being wrong and her being right but incomplete. He could not have said when this had happened. It seemed like something that had been building since September, since the desk that desks were for using, since the list with the subsections. He had, he realized, been paying attention. The Halloween feast was everything it was supposed to be. 1,000 candles overhead, live bats looping under the enchanted ceiling, pumpkins the size of armchairs carved and glowing at intervals down the 4 long tables. And Hermione was not there. Harry had clocked her absence approximately 30 seconds after sitting down in the automatic way he tracked things that mattered. The seat to his left was empty. She had left for the library that morning after an argument that had been, in the scale of their arguments, not even notable. The Quidditch schedule, the astronomy homework due Thursday, the question of which was more immediately urgent. She had said, "The homework is due Thursday, Harry." He had said, "Practice runs until 6 and I've already mapped out the star charts." She had given him the look that meant she found the star charts insufficient evidence of preparation and left for the library. She had not come back for lunch. She had not come back for the afternoon. She was not here now. Ron was eating with the uncomplicated enthusiasm of someone who believes that a feast requires his full attention. He paused when Harry didn't eat anything. "She'll come back before dessert," he said. "She should already be back," Harry said. "She loses track of time in libraries. She told me this." "She doesn't. She keeps a watch specifically, so she doesn't lose track of time in libraries." Ron looked at him. He started to say something, and then the great hall doors burst open. The man in the purple turban stumbled rather than walked. There was no other word for the forward lurch that brought him into the hall, arms gesticulating, face a map of terror. Professor Quirrell. He taught defense against the dark arts and spoke with a stutter that was bad enough that the class had learned to wait. He was not stuttering now. "Troll," he managed. "Troll in the dungeons." He looked around the hall with the look of someone who has just remembered where he is. "Thought you ought to know." He collapsed. The hall went, briefly, completely silent. Then the headmaster rose and said something in a voice that reached every corner without being raised, and the sound came back all at once. "Prefects," someone nearby shouted, "lead your houses back to the dormitories." Students were standing. Students were moving. The staircases would clog within 2 minutes. Harry knew this from 2 months of navigating them. He stood up and grabbed Ron's arm. "Hermione's in the library," he said, "or near it. She doesn't know about the troll." Ron looked at him. He looked at the streaming crowd of students moving toward the doors. He was already turning. "Well, then we go," he said. They went. The corridors emptied fast once the students had direction. Harry and Ron moved against the residual current, cut through a shortcut near the 3rd floor that Ron knew from his brothers, and came around toward the library from the east corridor, which was where the quickest route from the library to Gryffindor Tower actually went. It was empty. Harry's chest was doing something he didn't have a name for. Not exactly fear, but the compressed, focused feeling of someone who knows exactly what they have and is close to losing it. "She's not in the library," he said, before they reached it. The door was visible down the corridor, and it was closed and dark, and the library was never dark while Hermione was in it. She wouldn't be in the dark. "Bathroom?" Ron said. "Which one is closest to the library from this direction?" They found the bathroom by the smell. Something thick and wrong, animal in a way that the castle ordinarily wasn't, and under it a slow dripping of water. The door was already partly off its hinges. Harry pushed it open. The mountain troll was 12 feet tall and appeared to have made its way through the bathroom, largely by walking through the things that were in the way. 2 of the sinks had come away from the wall. Pipes had burst. The floor was wet and covered in debris, and the troll, grey-skinned, small-eyed, turning its enormous club in one hand with the slow satisfaction of something that has found its environment, was standing at the far end of the room facing a row of stalls. From inside the end stall, "I know that trolls have a very limited cranial capacity," Hermione's voice said, with the particular steadiness of someone concentrating very hard on being calm, "and that they respond primarily to—" She was attempting to reason with it. Harry had approximately 1 second to feel something that was entirely love and entirely exasperation, equally distributed, and then he acted on the one thing he'd done at school that he was genuinely good at. He grabbed the troll's ear and pulled himself up. The troll felt this and turned. Harry was now 12 feet in the air, arms around the neck of a mountain troll, with no further plan. He said so, loudly, to give Ron something to locate. Ron was already in the room with his wand out, tracking the club as the troll tried to reach backward and dislodge the thing on its neck. He pointed his wand at the club. "Wingardium Leviosa," he said. The pronunciation was exact. 3 weeks ago, in Charms, he had said it wrong. Wingardium, the stress in the wrong place, and Hermione had leaned across and said, "Swish and flick, and the gar is softer than that," and had nonetheless done it correctly on the next try. He had been practicing since. The club lifted. It went up smoothly, with the unhurried physics of a spell done right, until it was directly above the troll's head. Then Ron, Harry could see his face from above, set and a little pale, let the spell stop. The club came straight down. The troll went down. Harry climbed off the back of the collapsing troll with no particular grace and landed badly on his left ankle. He stood up. He looked at Ron. Ron looked at him. Hermione opened the stall door. She had a split lip and a lump forming on her shin where a piece of pipe had caught her, and she was holding her wand, and her hair was quite dramatically wrong. But she was standing and whole and looking between them with the specific expression of someone cataloguing damage. "You came to the library first," she said. "Obviously," Harry said. She looked at Ron. Ron shrugged with the forced casualness of someone pretending not to be rattled. "Your light was off," he said. "Library's closed in the dark." Hermione made a sound that was not quite a laugh. The door opened behind them. 3 professors arrived in quick succession. Dark green robes first, then black, then what remained of Quirrell, still looking pale, at the back. Harry watched the one in dark green survey the room, the troll, the destroyed fixtures, the 3 first years in the middle of it, with an expression that moved through several phases very quickly and arrived at something that was not going to be said in front of 2 colleagues. "Can you explain," she said, "what you are doing here?" Hermione stepped forward. Harry had expected this and was already letting her. "It's my fault," she said. "I went to look for the troll myself. I'd read that you could, that there was a method. I thought I could handle it, and I couldn't. Harry and Ron came to find me." She paused. "I'm sorry. It was a very poor decision." All 3 of them knew this was, at best, a partial version of events. The professors looked at Harry. Harry looked back without comment. They looked at Ron, who had the very specific expression of someone trying not to look like someone who has just been saved. 5 points taken from Gryffindor for Hermione's remarkably poor judgment. 10 points each to Harry and Ron for what the professor, with visible effort, called cool-headed courage under extraordinary circumstances. Quirrell was escorted out. Snape was already gone. They walked back to Gryffindor Tower without speaking and found the corner by the fire empty, everyone else having gone to bed. Ron sat. He looked at the fire for a long moment. "She lied for me," he said. "She didn't have to do that." "Obviously," Hermione said. Ron looked at her. He was working something out. Harry could see it. "We're a group," Harry said. Ron looked at the fire again. He looked at Hermione, who was examining the split on her lip with clinical interest. He looked at Harry. "Right," he said. "He said it the way you said something when you had just decided it. Not, I understand, or I agree, but I'm in." Hermione turned a page of the potions textbook she had, apparently, been holding through the entire encounter. Harry sat back and let his heart rate do something more reasonable. Somewhere in the castle there was a troll they had knocked unconscious. Somewhere in the castle, there was a purple turban that had announced it. He thought about these two things, and then set the thought aside, because tonight his sister was back, and a friend had come without being asked, and those were the things that were true right now. Hermione was not, as a general rule, someone who made errors of reasoning. She made errors of information, gaps in data that led her down routes that looked correct and turned out not to be, but the reasoning itself was nearly always sound. She had learned to distinguish between these two types of mistake, because conflating them was the kind of error that made you repeat it. She was sitting in the stands at the first Quidditch match of the year, watching Harry's broom try to throw him off, and she was making a note. The broom had been behaving normally for the first 4 minutes. Harry had pulled a tight arc over the Slytherin goalposts, and she had noted, with some satisfaction, she chose not to examine too closely, that he was considerably better than anyone else in the air. Better in a way that was not about training, but about instinct, some spatial intelligence that operated below the level of thought. Then his broom lurched again, began to buck sideways with the irregular rhythm of something fighting its own movement. Harry held on. He was very good at holding on to things. From the stands, the crowd was screaming. Hermione was watching the teacher's box. She had learned, from a year of structured observation, that when something went wrong in a contained environment, the most useful thing to look at was not the thing going wrong, but the people who might have caused it. She looked at the teachers. She looked at each face. Professor Snape's lips were moving. She did not hesitate. She pulled out her wand, moved along the row with the quick efficiency of someone who knows exactly where she's going, and set the hem of his robes on fire. Not much, just enough. He yelped, stopped moving his lips, and the fire was out in 3 seconds. Harry's broom steadied. Later, in the common room, she wrote down what she knew. Snape's lips were moving when the broom started to misbehave. The broom stopped misbehaving when his attention was redirected. Snape had been looking at Harry in the specific evaluating way he always looked at Harry, not the general hostility he distributed across Gryffindor, but something more pointed. And Snape had been in an empty corridor on the 3rd floor last week. She had seen him limping away from that direction. And the 3rd floor was where the locked door was, the one they were not supposed to go near. She constructed the hypothesis with the care of someone who understood that hypotheses were not conclusions. Snape was interested in whatever was behind the 3rd floor door. Snape had jinxed Harry's broom at the Quidditch match. Snape had something to gain from Harry being removed from the game, or from the match being disrupted, or, she tested the logic from several angles, from demonstrating that he had a hold over something. It was a sound argument on the available evidence. She told Harry and Ron. "I knew it," Ron said immediately, in the tone of someone who had actually not known it, but was delighted to have it confirmed. Harry was quieter. He looked at Hermione's notes with the particular attention he gave to things he was deciding whether to fully believe. "What does he want with whatever's on the 3rd floor?" he said. "That," Hermione said, "is what we need to find out." They were careful. They were, Hermione was clear to herself, being very careful. They were not going to the 3rd floor. They were merely paying attention, gathering information, being the kind of alert that their situation required. The 3rd floor corridor was off limits, and she had been told the reason, something dangerous, and she accepted this. Something was clearly very dangerous, given the 3-headed dog she had read about in Fantastic Beasts and Witches Dangerous, though it did not use that title, and they were therefore not going there. They went there by accident, on a Tuesday evening in late November. It was Filch's fault, technically. The castle's caretaker had an unerring ability to appear in the corridor you were leaving through, and to take the specific tone of someone who has been looking for you in particular. Harry, Ron, and Hermione had been in the library past curfew. Hermione had been studying, and Harry and Ron had been, in theory, helping her study, though the ratio of study to whispered argument about Quidditch statistics had not been 60-40. And when Filch came around the corner with a lantern and a look, they had run. The castle at night had more wrong turns than it did during the day. Stairways moved. Corridors that went somewhere at 8 o'clock did not necessarily go there at 11. They went right where they should have gone left, through a tapestry that was not a shortcut, up half a staircase that terminated in a locked door, and when they heard Filch again, that particular echoing step, the creak of him, Harry grabbed a door handle in the dark, and they all went through it. The corridor beyond was dim. There was a smell. There was a very large shape in the darkness that was not. Hermione's brain had a moment to process before her body moved. One shape. It was 3 shapes. 3 shapes attached to one enormous body, which was standing on what was definitely a trapdoor, and all 3 heads had been asleep and were now extremely awake. They went back through the door and ran. They made it back to Gryffindor Tower by a route Hermione was not able to reconstruct afterward, which bothered her more than the 3-headed dog slightly. In the common room, they sat and breathed. "Trapdoor," Harry said, when he could. "3 heads," Ron said, unhelpfully. "Something under the trapdoor," Hermione said. "That's what it's guarding. Not just guarding the corridor. Standing on something. Something important enough," Harry said, "to need a 3-headed dog." "We need to think about this properly," Hermione said, which was how she said, "I have already been thinking about this, and am several steps ahead, but want to give you the impression that we are arriving here together." She did not tell them the other thing she had been thinking about. The other thing was, Snape's lips moving at the Quidditch match was consistent with a jinx, but it was also consistent with a counter-jinx, and she had been reviewing, without anyone asking her to, her understanding of Snape's behavior, and it was not quite the shape of someone who was trying to steal something. It was more like the shape of someone who knew something was being stolen and was trying to prevent it. She needed more information. She wrote this down on a separate page and kept it separate. November gave her 2 more pieces. Harry told her, in the middle of October, actually early November, he had been filing it, that his scar had been hurting. Not once, twice. Once in potions, once passing someone in the corridor. He described the quality of it carefully. Sharp, specific, foreign, like pressure from the wrong direction. She wrote it down. She did not tell him what she was beginning to think. She needed the 3rd point before she was willing to say it. Harry's scar in potions was consistent with Snape. Harry's scar in the corridor was not, unless Snape had also been in that corridor. And she didn't know which corridor, and he had not said. She wrote, "The data does not yet converge." And then she wrote, below it, the thing she was not going to say to anyone yet. "It is not converging on Snape." Harry came to her in December, the last week of term, and said he had talked to Dumbledore. "What did he say?" she asked. "Nothing," Harry said. He confirmed the question and said nothing. She looked at him. "He knew you were asking." "Yes." "And he didn't tell you to stop looking." Harry was quiet for a moment. "He didn't tell me anything useful," he said. "But he wasn't worried about me knowing. He wasn't anything, really. Just not afraid." She considered this. Dumbledore was the only person she had read whom Voldemort had ever feared. He was not afraid of whatever was under the trapdoor. He was not afraid of whatever was using Quirrell. She stopped the thought. She was not ready to say that. She had not said it yet, even to herself. She looked at her notes she said. "He's not untouchable. He's just not frightened." "Yes," Harry said. "That's useful," she said. "It means the thing can be faced. It just means it hasn't been faced yet." They looked at each other across the common room table. The fire was low. Outside, the first snow of December was coming down. She turned back to her notes, and he let her. And that was what it meant, that he knew her. He could tell the difference between her thinking alone and her needing company, and on this occasion she was doing the first thing, and he went to sit by the window and let her do it. The Hogwarts Express went south, and Harry watched England appear outside the window, grey and wet and December, and did not feel the homesickness he had spent 10 years not being allowed to feel toward anything. He felt something else. Something that was not a name yet, but that pulled in a specific direction, like a compass finding north. The Granger house had a real Christmas tree. This was not, Harry knew, remarkable. Most houses had them. But he stood in the doorway and looked at it for a moment before anyone noticed, because it was the kind of ordinary thing he had been on the outside of for long enough that ordinary things still occasionally stopped him. The presents appeared on Christmas Eve. Not many, but considered, the kind that required knowing what someone liked rather than performing the idea of a gift. Mr. Granger, who had spent 4 months paying close attention, gave Harry a book about the history of the Quidditch World Cup and a compass that worked inside Hogwarts, which was, Harry gathered, not a given. Mrs. Granger gave him a jumper, not hand-me-down, not too large, specifically his size, and a dark green she said would suit him. Hermione gave him a revised study schedule that she had spent, Harry suspected, more time on than the present warranted, and which was organized by subject and color-coded. Harry looked at all of it. He sat with the strange experience of having been given things by people who had thought about what he might want. He had been given things before, Hagrid's birthday cake, the way the magical world had produced his wand and his school things. But those were categorical, the provision of necessities. This was different. This was personal. He did not know what to say. He said thank you, which was true, and accepted that it might be a while before he knew how to say what he actually meant. On Christmas morning, there was a parcel that had not been there the night before. It was on the floor at the foot of his bed, wrapped in ordinary brown paper, and there was no name on it, no card attached, nothing to say who had sent it. He sat up and unwrapped it in the grey early light before the house was awake. Inside was a cloak. He pulled it out, and the fabric moved in the way that fabrics were not supposed to move. Not quite liquid, but not quite solid, flowing around his hands, and then over them until his hands disappeared. Not the room, not the air. His hands. He turned them over and saw nothing where his hands were. The card was at the bottom of the wrapping. He read it twice. Your father left this cloak in my possession before he died. It is time it was returned to you. Use it well. He sat for a long time. The cloak pooled in his lap, weightless, the shimmer of it more felt than seen. His father had owned this. James Potter, who had dark, untidy hair, exactly like Harry's own, who had been a Gryffindor and a Quidditch player, had left this with someone before the end, and that someone had kept it for 10 years and now sent it back. He thought about his father carrying it. He thought about the decade in between. He put the cloak away carefully and went downstairs, and Christmas breakfast was eggs and toast and Mrs. Granger asking if he had slept well. And he said yes. He kept the cloak, and what it meant, somewhere private for now. He was learning that not all things had to be processed immediately, and that some things were better turned over quietly, at the pace they required. He went back to Hogwarts 3 days ahead of most students. He told Hermione he wanted a few days in the library. This was not precisely true, but it was not precisely a lie. He did go to the library the first afternoon, and sat with a book he did not read for 45 minutes before the restlessness made him get up. The cloak was in his trunk. He took it out that evening and put it on, and found that it worked in the empty castle exactly as well as it had worked on his hands in the grey Christmas morning bedroom. He had not expected to find anything. He had expected to walk. The castle at night was different from the castle during the day, quieter, not in the absence of sound, but in the quality of it, the way it carried. He went places he hadn't been, turned down corridors he usually didn't have time for, climbed staircases because they were there. He found the room without quite knowing how he'd arrived at it, a door slightly ajar, light that shouldn't have been inside. He went through. The mirror was taller than he was, with an ornate frame, the inscription along the top in a script he sounded out slowly. Erised stra eru, oit ube kafru oit on vosse. He looked at it for a long moment. He thought about what it must say if you read it properly. He stepped in front of it. The reflection gave him back a room that was not quite the room he was standing in. He was there, himself, in the cloak, pushed back from his shoulders. But behind him, arranged with the loose naturalness of people who have been in the same space for a long time, were others. Two he had never seen. A man whose hair was dark and untidy in exactly the way Harry's was, the same angle of it, the same unwillingness to lie flat. And a woman beside him with green eyes, not like green eyes in general, like his green eyes specifically, the same shade and shape of them, the same quality of being a little too bright, a little too emphatic, as though whoever had designed them had felt strongly about the colour. His mother's eyes, his father's hair. Here they were. And beside them, behind him, to the left, slightly overlapping in the way that people in photographs overlapped when there were a lot of them, were Mr. and Mrs. Granger, and Hermione. He stood very still. He had expected, if he thought about it, and he had not quite let himself think about it, to see his parents. He had expected that what he wanted most in the places he didn't examine was the family he had lost, and they were there. But so was the family that had found him, or that he had found, or that had been assembled by a series of accidents on a London street in August. Both. His deepest desire was not to choose, it was to have both. He stood at the mirror for a long time. He was not sure how long. The figures in the mirror did not move, but they were present, the particular presence of things that are real in the way that the deepest things are real, below the level of fact. I had a feeling I would find you here. Dumbledore sat down on the floor beside the mirror with the unhurried ease of a very old man who has long since decided that the most comfortable position is the one that is available. Harry, without quite deciding to, sat down beside him. It shows the most desperate desire of the heart, Dumbledore said, not the face. What is behind the face? He looked at the mirror with an expression that was not readable. I have arranged to have it moved. It is not good, I think, to spend too long in front of it. Harry thought about this. What do you see? He asked. I see something, Dumbledore said, which was not the same as answering. He said it in the tone of someone who has been asked this before and who does not intend to answer it here. Harry looked at his parents in the mirror. He said, would they have approved? Of the Grangers? Dumbledore considered this with the seriousness of someone who has been asked a real question and is going to answer it really. Your mother, he said, after a moment, had a very specific kind of highest praise. She reserved it for people she said were proud and accepting. He paused. It was the thing she thought was hardest to be. She thought most people managed one or the other, but rarely both. Harry looked at the mirror. The Grangers were still there. Mr. Granger, who had put down his newspaper and said good to know. Mrs. Granger, who had hugged him at a train station without making it a question. "Yes," he said. "I think they would have." Dumbledore said nothing more. He sat beside Harry for a few minutes in the quiet, and then got up and walked away, and Harry stayed until the cold of the floor came through, and then he got up too. The train back from London ran through January rain. Hermione had a book. Harry watched the countryside and thought about the mirror and what it had shown him, and about a cloak that had been kept 10 years in trust, and about the word his mother had used for the best thing a person could be. When they arrived at the Granger house, picking up their things before the return journey to Hogwarts, one overnight's detour, Mrs. Granger opened the door and said, "Good trip?" "Yes," Harry said. He meant, "More than you know." He meant, "I saw you in the mirror and understood what that meant." He meant, "I think my mother would have liked you." He was learning, slowly, which of the things he meant were for saying and which were for keeping. This one he kept for now, and let the warmth of it stay somewhere it wouldn't be lost. In February, Hermione stopped writing Snape's name at the top of the page. She did not announce this. She did not tell Harry or Ron or make any particular point of the revision, because revising a hypothesis was not an event. It was simply what you did when the evidence required it. She took the sheet with Snape's name on it and put it behind the other sheets and wrote a new heading on a new page and began again. The problem with her original conclusion was not the logic. She had followed the logic correctly from the evidence available. At the Quidditch match, Snape's lips had been moving. His attention had been on Harry. The broom had been misbehaving. When she had redirected his attention, the broom had stopped. This was clean inference. She had been right to draw it. What she had done wrong was to stop there. She had not asked, at the time, in the excitement of the conclusion, what shape of person tried to steal a powerful and ancient magical object from under the headmaster's nose. She was asking now. And Snape, when she looked at him in the cold light of February, was not that shape. Snape was the shape of a person with a secret he had been carrying for a long time and had decided to keep. He was not the shape of a person in motion. Someone trying to steal the stone would be in motion. They would be pressing, testing, looking for a way through. Snape was watching. He was holding the line of something. She had seen him twice in the corridor near the 3rd floor, and on both occasions he had been coming away from it, not going toward it. Counter-jinxing, not jinxing. Guarding, not stealing. She wrote this down and looked at it, and said nothing to anyone. She began watching Quirrell. The Defense Against the Dark Arts professor was, she had assumed, simply someone who had been frightened by his own subject. A not uncommon phenomenon among people who researched dangerous things and discovered in the field that they were actually dangerous. He stuttered. He was jumpy. He wore a purple turban that he explained, when anyone asked, had been given to him by an African prince in thanks for dealing with a zombie, which was the kind of story that explained exactly nothing. What she noticed in February and March was this. He turned his back to the class during lectures. Not occasionally, consistently, habitually, always. He taught them to face the board and spoke toward the wall as often as he spoke toward the room. This bothered her in a way she took seriously, because the things that bothered her usually meant something. She noticed something else. When Snape appeared in a doorway, which he did, twice, while she was in a position to see clearly, Quirrell's reaction was not the reaction of a man in the presence of a colleague. It was the reaction of a man in the presence of someone who might find him out. The sweat, the stutter worsening, the way he stepped back and then tried to make the step look natural. She had seen that reaction before. She had seen it on Dudley Dursley, she thought. No, not Dudley specifically, but the type of it, the flinch from authority that was not ordinary hierarchy fear, but the specific fear of someone who was doing something wrong and knew it. Quirrell was afraid of being caught, not of Snape as an authority, of Snape as someone who was looking for him. She wrote this down and put it with the new page. Harry told her, at the beginning of March, that his scar had not stopped hurting. She had known something was wrong since January, when he had started sitting in the back row of Dada and keeping his face very still in a way she recognized as the controlled blankness he used when something was bothering him, and he was trying not to let it show. She had waited for him to tell her, because telling her was how he had decided to handle things, and he needed to have decided, so she had waited. "Every class," he said. "Not just sometimes. Every time." She did not say, "I told you this wasn't Snape." She said, "Show me where on the page you're sitting." And he showed her, and it was the furthest point from the front of the classroom, the seat closest to the door, which also meant the seat furthest from the back of Quirrell's turban. "Sit there when you can," she said. "Tell me if it changes." He looked at her. He was doing the calculation she was doing. She could see it, following the same line of reasoning toward the same place. Neither of them said the place out loud yet. Neville found them in herbology on a Tuesday in late March, which was where he was usually most comfortable, and mentioned, while repotting something that smelled strongly of compost and mild alarm, that he had seen Professor Quirrell arguing with someone in an empty corridor. "When?" Harry said. "Last Thursday. I got turned around near the second floor. I know. And I went past this corridor, and there were voices, and I didn't want to interrupt, so I waited. And when I looked, it was Professor Quirrell and someone else. Couldn't see who, but Professor Quirrell was shaking. Shaking like frightened, Harry said. Or shaking like angry. Neville thought about this. Both, sort of, he said, but mostly frightened. He said. Neville frowned with the effort of retrieval. Something about not wanting to. Something like, I don't know how. And then the other voice said something I couldn't hear. And then Quirrell said, I will, and stopped shaking quite as much. Neville looked between them. Is it important? Yes, Harry said. Thank you. Neville accepted this and went back to his pot, looking simultaneously pleased and unsettled. They spent 3 evenings on it, Harry and Ron and Hermione in the corner by the fire, long past when they should have been in bed. Hermione laid out the revised theory with the same care she gave to a transfiguration essay, step by documented step. The stone, the philosopher's stone, was the only object of that kind of value that would be hidden this way, with this many layers of protection. Hagrid had collected something from Gringotts Vault 713 on the same day he took Harry to Diagon Alley in July. She had found a reference to Nicholas Flamel in a library book, a French alchemist, 665 years old, the only known maker of the Philosopher's Stone. The stone had been moved from Gringotts and brought to Hogwarts. It was under the trapdoor, and Quirrell, possessed, she believed now, with the flat certainty of someone who has followed the evidence to its end, was trying to take it for whoever had been in that corridor, whoever had made him stop shaking and say, I will. Ron said at the end of the 3rd evening, but Dumbledore's here. Someone will stop him. Someone would have stopped him already, Hermione said, if that were true. Ron frowned. What if Dumbledore doesn't know? Dumbledore knows, Harry said. His hand had moved to his scar without him noticing, the unconscious gesture she had watched become more frequent since March. Then he's got a plan, Ron said. Then we're not in his plan, Harry said. The fire crackled. Outside, April rain moved against the windows. The common room was empty. Hermione looked at her notes, and at the documented shape of everything she now knew, and at the gap at the end of it. The question that the evidence produced, but that none of them wanted to say. If he gets the stone, she said, and whatever is in that turban uses it. Someone needs to go through the trap door before he does, Harry said. Ron looked at both of them. He said, I thought we were students. We are, Hermione said. Right, Ron said. He was quiet for a moment. Right. Harry said nothing. He looked at the fire. He was the only one of them, Hermione thought, who had understood where this was going from the beginning. Not because he was cleverer than she would never concede that, but because he had grown up without the assumption that someone responsible would step in. He had never been someone else's plan. She looked at him. He looked at the fire. His scar, she suspected, was telling him something she didn't have the instrument to hear. She turned to a new page. The word came through Neville, who had overheard a prefect say it to another prefect while pretending to be invisible in the way that round-faced, frequently underestimated people learned to be invisible. Dumbledore had been called to the ministry. Urgent business. He would be gone by nightfall, Harry told Hermione at dinner. She set down her fork. They were in the common room by 8. Ron came in from Quidditch practice, and they told him. He sat down and listened with the focused stillness he reserved for chess problems, all the distracting energy suddenly internal, accounted for, directed somewhere useful. We go tonight, Hermione said. We have no evidence anyone would believe, Harry said. I know. That's what I've been thinking. We've been over this, Ron said. What's the thinking? We go tonight, Hermione said again. It was not a question the second time. Harry looked at her. He thought about the scar, which had been aching since breakfast, in the particular way of something at low boil, something that was building toward a temperature. He thought about the open trap door they had seen in November, and the figure of Quirrell in an empty corridor saying, I will, in a shaking voice, and the fact that the only person in the castle who knew the full shape of what was happening had just been called away from it. Yes, he said. They went up through the castle after 9, when the corridors were empty. Harry wore the cloak and walked between them, which was not strictly necessary. The cloak only covered one person with certainty, but felt like the right arrangement for the night. They reached the 3rd floor, went through the door, and found Fluffy already asleep. Not asleep. Enchanted. There was a harp on the floor playing itself, a slow looping melody that kept the 3 great heads weighted and still. Quirrell. He had been here. They were not first. He's already gone through, Ron said. Then we go through, Harry said. The trapdoor was open. Harry went first, into the dark below. The drop was longer than expected, and the landing was something that gave, rather than held, soft, rustling, closing. He reached out and felt it closing around his wrists, and pulled and found it pulling back. Don't struggle, Hermione said from somewhere to his right, her voice the controlled kind of calm that required effort. It's Devil's Snare. The more you move. Ron made a noise that indicated he had begun to understand this. Harry went still. He had learned, in a cupboard under a staircase, that dark and enclosed were states he could inhabit without panicking, which was not a thing he would have chosen to know about himself, but which was, at this moment, genuinely useful. He held his breath and felt the plant ease fractionally, testing. I know what to do, Hermione said. Don't move." He could hear her voice shift into the register it took when she was working, not speaking to them, speaking past them, to the thing she was about to do. Light erupted. Not wand light, something brighter and more total, the specific quality of sunlight produced without a sun, and the plant reacted immediately, releasing with a speed that was almost revulsion, contracting away from the source, and then they were falling again, shorter this time, and landed on a stone floor in a heap. "Lumos Solum," Hermione said, wand still lit, looking at where the devil's snare was retreating back into its chamber above. She said it with quiet precision, the way she said things she had prepared for. "Did you know that would work?" Ron asked from the floor. "Yes," she said. "Get up." The next chamber had its own sounds before they saw it, a high, papery rustling, like a very large room full of birds. They went through and found it was keys, hundreds of them, winged, turning slow circles in the air at every level of a chamber that was the height of 4 floors. The door at the far end had a keyhole, bright and waiting. Broomsticks were propped against the wall. Harry looked up. He had played Seeker since October. He had spent more hours on a broom than off one, some weeks. He had learned to read the air above a Quidditch pitch, the currents, the angles, the way a fast-moving thing left traces in the space it had just passed through. He looked at the mass of wheeling keys, and his eye moved through them with the involuntary sorting of a mind that had been trained to find the right thing at speed. There. Brighter plumage, one wing at an odd angle, already slightly bent, already been used. He took a broom, went up, and did not rush. Rushing was how you missed things. He circled wide, watching the key's pattern, the way it dropped slightly when the bent wing compensated. He cut through the main mass from the eastern side, took the key on the second pass, and was down and at the lock in slightly under 4 minutes. From below, Ron said, "It felt longer." "It always does," Hermione said, with the tone of someone who had looked it up. The chess set was enormous. They stood at the edge of a board that covered the full floor of the next chamber, each piece the size of a person, stone and still and waiting. Harry knew chess in the casual way of someone who had played against Ron enough times to understand the rules without being particularly good at them. Ron walked to the center of the board and turned slowly, reading the position with the eyes of someone for whom this was a different kind of language entirely. "There's a position here," Ron said. He was quiet for a moment. "We're the missing pieces. We have to play across." "We can win," Hermione said. "Yes." He was still reading the board. "But not without a sacrifice. There's no path that doesn't ask for one." He turned. "I need to play a knight, and I need to let the Queen take me." Harry said, "There has to be another way." Ron looked at him. The expression on his face was not the bravado of someone trying to sound brave, and not quite managing it. It was something plainer and harder, the expression of someone who has already worked through the alternatives and arrived calmly at the only one that works. Harry had seen this expression before, not on Ron but on Hermione, when she followed logic to a conclusion she didn't like and accepted it anyway. "There isn't," Ron said. "I've looked. It's the only sequence that opens the far side for both of you." "Not both of us," Hermione said. She said it quietly, already knowing. Ron nodded. "One of you needs to go back for help. One goes forward. I'm the way through." He looked at Harry. "You have to be the one going forward. You know that." Harry did know. He had known it since April, the night by the fire. He was the one Quirrell was working toward. He was the one the scar was about. He was, in whatever way he had not yet fully understood, the one this was for. He looked at Ron and did not argue again. They took their places. Hermione was a castle. Harry was a bishop. Ron walked his knight to the space that would draw the Queen, and the Queen came. She came with the deliberate speed of something that had no personal feeling about what it was doing, and she took the knight, and Ron went down. Hermione was at his side in 3 strides. She checked him with quick hands. Breathing, she said, and something in Harry's chest unlocked slightly. Unconscious, she said, and tightened again, but differently. She looked up. "I'll go back for help," she said. "Dumbledore, or someone. I'll make someone listen." He looked at her. She was kneeling on the chessboard next to Ron with her wand out, her hair entirely wrong, holding herself together with the specific effort of someone who is not going to be frightened here, and has decided this. He thought about the Granger stairs. He thought about the list with the subsections. "I'll be careful," he said. "I know," she said. She did not look away from him. "Don't be stupid about it." "I'll do my best. I know that too." She reached up and put her hand on his arm, once. Briefly. Not a hug, not ceremony. Just contact. Just. "I know where you're going, and I would go with you if I could." And then she was back at Ron's side, and he was turning toward the far door. He went through alone. Behind him, Hermione's voice, low and steady. Ron, wake up! I need you to wake up now." He kept walking. He kept walking because she was back there, and he was going forward. And that was what it meant to have someone behind you. That the going forward was possible, because there was somewhere to come back to. The chamber beyond the chess room was the smallest yet, and the wrongest. Wrong in the way of a room that had been constructed for a purpose it had not yet served. The air tight, expectant, the walls throwing back a faint shimmer of the fire that burned in 2 archways, one behind Harry and one ahead. Between them, arranged on a stone ledge, were 7 bottles, different shapes, different sizes. Beside them, a folded parchment. Harry read it. He read it twice, in the way Hermione had taught him without meaning to. Once for comprehension, once for what the words meant to each other, the relationships between them. He looked at the bottles. He thought about the clues. Poison, nettle wine, the largest bottle forwards, the smallest bottle back. He thought about what moved from left to right. He thought about what the parchment said about the second from the left. He was not Hermione. He knew this. He did not have her gift for logic as a primary language, the way she could inhabit an argument the way other people inhabited rooms. But he had watched her think for a year. He had watched her process, the elimination, the patience of following each thread before trusting the conclusion. He applied what he had absorbed. He picked up the smallest bottle. He drank. Cold, a cold that moved through him like a hand smoothing from chest to feet, and the fire ahead turned purple and parted. He went through. The final chamber was dark, except for one source of light, which was also the one thing in the room, the mirror of Erised. He had last stood in front of it in January, in the empty castle with the invisibility cloak still warm from the walk over, and it had shown him his dead parents and his living family side by side, had shown him that his deepest desire was not to choose between loss and what had been found. He knew this mirror. He knew what it did. In front of it, his back to Harry. Quirrell. He was standing with his hands clasped behind him, staring into the surface with the fixed intensity of someone who has been at a problem for a long time without solving it. He did not turn around. He said, "I wondered when you would come." His voice was different. The stutter was entirely absent. The voice, without the stutter, was something else. Flatter, more deliberate, as though the stutter had been a garment set aside. "Potter," he said. It still came out as the old name, not the new one. Harry thought he understood why. "Come and look." Harry did not move. Quirrell turned. He looked, Harry thought, like a man who had already spent himself on something else, hollowed, the face too thin, the purple turban incongruous over the drawn features. Then he reached up and began to unwrap it. The turban came away in slow loops. Quirrell turned around again, all the way around, until his back was to Harry, and Harry saw the face. Barely a face. That was the only way to hold it. Barely a face, in the place where the back of a head should have been. Flat-nosed, red-eyed, the skin stretched wrongly, the whole of it suggesting a human face, the way that a shadow suggested a person. Not a face that had been made, but one that had been pressed into the wrong material and was holding on. When it spoke, the voice came from everywhere and where, from inside the room and inside Harry's skull simultaneously, and the cold in Harry's chest from the potion was nothing compared to what moved through him at the sound of it. He had heard this voice once before, in the dark of a forest, in a story Hagrid had told him on the night of his 11th birthday. The voice of the thing that had killed his parents. It was smaller now, constrained, but it was unmistakably the same. "You," it said. "I have been waiting for you for a very long time." "Look into the mirror," Quirrell said, from the front of his own head. "Look and tell me what you see." Harry looked. He was prepared for his parents. He was prepared for the Grangers, for Hermione, for the double image of loss, and found that the mirror had given him in January. He was prepared, in some bone-deep way he could not have named, for whatever he wanted most. He saw himself standing in the mirror's surface, and in his hand, in the reflection's hand, a small stone caught the light. Red. No larger than an egg. The stone. He felt it arrive in his pocket. A weight, sudden and solid. His face in the mirror showed nothing. He was good at showing nothing. He had been practicing since before he knew what he was practicing. "I see myself," he said, "winning the house cup, shaking the headmaster's hand." The silence was brief and had a specific quality, the quality of someone deciding. "You are lying," Voldemort said. Quirrell moved. He was faster than he looked. People who moved without preliminary always were. And his hand closed around Harry's wrist. And then Quirrell screamed. It was the scream of something involuntary, not pain performed, but pain happening, the kind that bypassed the decision to make noise. His grip released. Harry stepped back and looked at his own wrist, unmarked. He looked at Quirrell's hand, blistering. Quirrell came again. The same result. The hand that touched Harry burned, and Quirrell's face contorted with the effort of continuing, and he continued anyway, because the voice on the back of his head was giving instructions in something that had left language behind, older than language, and Quirrell's own face was ashen, and following them with the resolute expression of someone who had agreed to something a long time ago, and was honoring the agreement. Harry did not have a plan. He had the stone in his pocket, and the knowledge that he needed to keep hold of it, and an instinct that had served him for 11 years. Hold on. Stay present. Do not stop thinking. He had stayed present in a cupboard under a staircase. He had stayed present at the Dursleys for a decade. He was staying present now. He thought about Hermione's voice in the chess room. Don't be stupid about it. And thought, I'm trying. Quirrell's hands closed on Harry's face. The burn, if it was a burn, was not what Harry expected. It was total, a whiteness that went through everything, and with it a sound that was not a sound, and a sensation of something vast and angry being thwarted. Quirrell screamed and screamed. The hands pressed harder, and then released, and then everything changed. It was very fast. The man who had been holding him was crumbling, not falling, crumbling, the way something too dry fell apart under pressure, becoming less coherent, the substance of him failing. Harry had time to see this. And then something happened that was not a physical thing, a presence that had been in the room becoming a presence that was leaving it, passing through him, rushing, cold and furious. And then it was gone. And then Harry was on the floor. He was on the floor of the final chamber with the mirror of Erist opposite him and Quirrell, what remained of Quirrell, in a heap that was already still. The stone was in his pocket. His scar was not hurting. He noticed this last thing with a kind of stunned attention. His scar had been hurting, with varying intensity, since September. 9 months. He had learned its different registers the way you learned the different creaks of a house, the way you learned which step was the loose one. It had become a constant, a fact of his year. It was not hurting. The quiet that settled in the chamber was of a different quality than the quiet before. Not expectant, not wrong, simply quiet. He lay on the floor and breathed. He thought about the Granger stairs in August, the carpeted steps in the dark, and Hermione sitting beside him without asking why. He thought about the 4th step that creaked on the left side. He thought about Mrs. Granger at King's Cross in September, with her arms around him at a train station, and the way he had, with some effort, held himself less braced than he might have been. He thought, I did my best. He thought about Hermione saying, I know, and about the stone in his pocket, and about the mirror across the room, which was showing something he couldn't see from this angle, and about the fact that his scar had stopped hurting, which was going to matter a great deal to him when he had energy to let it. He thought, someone is going to come. Hermione said she was going for help. She would have gone for help. Someone is coming. He did not know how long he lay there. The cold from the potion had worn off. The chamber was not warm. He lay and breathed and held the thought that someone was coming with the same care he had held on to things across a year. Across, really, his whole life. The things that were worth holding. His scar didn't hurt. He let that be the last thing he noticed, and the dark came in. The first thing Harry was aware of was white. White ceiling, white curtains, the particular quality of light that meant the windows were large and the day was already well along. He lay for a moment, cataloguing the information. A bed that was not his bed, though better than most beds he'd been in. A smell that suggested potions and linen stored in something herbal. The sound of someone breathing steadily to his left, and someone breathing differently, with more intention, to his right. He turned his head. Ron in the next bed was asleep, or recovering, the colour of his face suggested, with his right arm strapped and elevated. And in the chair between the beds, curled in the specific pretzel of someone who has been in a chair for too many hours and has not left, Hermione, awake, looking at him over the top of a book with an expression that resolved immediately into relief, and then, just as quickly, into the brisk practicality she used to cover feelings she considered excessive. "You've been out for 3 days," she said. "Ron. Cracked ribs from the chess queen. He woke up yesterday. He's been in and out." She set the book down. "Dumbledore wants to speak to you when you're ready." Harry lay back. He noticed, with the clarity of something that had become a constant and was suddenly absent. His scar was not hurting. 9 months of varying intensities. Sharp, dull. The specific ache of proximity. The pressure of something pressing from the wrong side. And now nothing. The skin of his forehead felt ordinary. He pressed a finger to the mark and felt only the ridge of old scar tissue. No heat beneath it. No weight. "The stone," he said. "Destroyed," she said. "Dumbledore will explain the rest." Dumbledore came that afternoon and sat in the same chair Hermione had been in, and looked at Harry with the expression of someone who has been thinking about what to say and has settled on honesty as the approach most likely to be useful. He told Harry that the stone was gone, not taken, but destroyed. Nicholas Flamel had been 665 years old and had chosen this with full information, and there was, Dumbledore said, a particular peace in that kind of death. He told Harry that Voldemort had not been destroyed, only driven off, returned to the formless existence he had maintained since 1981. He would find other means, eventually, but not for some time. "Why did it work?" Harry asked. "Quirrell touching me. Why did it burn him?" Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. He appeared to be deciding how much of the truth was useful, and arrived at all of it. "Your mother," he said, "chose to die rather than step aside. She was given the option. Voldemort told her to move, told her she didn't have to die. She didn't move. That choice, the specific sacrifice of a parent who could have lived and didn't, created something. A protection that lived not in any house or blood relation, but in you, in your blood, permanently, for as long as you live." He paused. "When Quirrell touched you, when Voldemort tried to come close to you through him, the protection activated. It wasn't something you did. It was something she left." Harry sat with this. The ceiling was white and ordinary, and outside the windows he could hear, distantly, the sounds of the castle finishing its year. "She left it in me," he said. "Not in a place." "Yes," Dumbledore said. "Not in a place." After Dumbledore left, Harry looked at the ceiling and thought about the blood-home charm, the one that had required him to call Petunia's house home and had been weakening for years because he never had. And he thought about this other thing, his mother's protection, which was not a place, and had not been weakening at all. One mechanism had depended on belonging somewhere. The other simply was. Patient, unconditional, the kind of protection that required nothing from him. He had not belonged at Privet Drive. He had belonged, for the past 11 months, to a family that had chosen him. The charm Lily left had not depended on that. It had been there regardless. He found this, in a way he couldn't entirely explain, more moving than anything else Dumbledore had told him. The end-of-year feast was on a Tuesday evening, and Gryffindor was in 3rd place when it began. The hall was decorated in Slytherin's colours, the green and silver of an uncontested year, and the mood of the Gryffindor table was the particular resignation of people who have had a difficult 12 months and have come to terms with the arithmetic. Then Dumbledore stood up. He said he had a few last-minute points to give. He said, "To Harry James Potter, 60 points, for pure nerve and outstanding courage." He said, "To Ronald Bilius Weasley, 50 points, for the best-played game of chess Hogwarts has seen in many years." He said, "To Hermione Granger, 50 points, for the use of cool logic in the face of fire." He said, "To Neville Longbottom, 10 points, for rare courage of standing up to your friends." The hall was silent for the precise duration of everyone computing the new total. Then the Gryffindor table erupted, and the decorations changed, and the house, that had been in 3rd place, was in 1st. Harry did not hear most of what happened around him. He was watching Ron's face. Pure, undone joy, the face of someone who has just had something he hadn't known he was hoping for. And Hermione, who had tears running down her face and was absolutely not crying, was categorically not crying if anyone asked, which they had better not. Neville looked at Harry from 3 seats down, pink and stunned. Harry raised his eyebrows. Neville raised his back. It was, between people who had learned to say a great deal with very small gestures, a complete conversation. On the Hogwarts Express, Fred and George appeared in the compartment doorway 40 minutes out and proceeded to be thoroughly annoying to Percy for the remainder of the journey, which Percy endured with the resigned dignity of someone who has accepted that this is the nature of brothers. Ron slept. Harry watched England come back through the window, grey and green and rained on, and didn't feel the flat weight that had always accompanied the journey south before. He was going to a place with a door that locked from the inside. He was going to a place where someone would ask how the trip was and mean it. He was going to a place that was, by any measure he had learned to apply, home. The Grangers were on the platform. Mrs. Granger spotted them through the crowd before Harry had finished navigating Hedwig's cage through the carriage door. She was already waving by the time Harry and Hermione reached the barrier. Mr. Granger had his hands in his pockets and was smiling, not performing welcome, simply being glad, which was what welcome looked like from a man who expressed himself through presence rather than announcement. Hermione walked to them. Harry was half a step behind, one hand on Hedwig's cage, trunk at his side. Mrs. Granger took the cage from him without asking, handed it sideways to Mr. Granger, and put her arms around Harry. He did not go rigid. He had worked on this. He had been working on it since August, with mixed results, improving by degrees. The small recalibrations of a person learning that contact was not a prelude to something else, that warmth did not have conditions, that the act of being held was simply the act of being held. He let himself be held. He put one arm around her, briefly, and it was ordinary, and he let it be. In the back seat of the car, somewhere south of the motorway, Hermione looked up from her book. Harry was asleep. He had been asleep, she thought, since before they left the car park, out with the sudden completeness of someone whose body had decided, unilaterally, that enough had been done, and the rest could wait. He slept without tension. That was what she noticed. He slept the way people slept when they were not braced for interruption, the face at rest, the shoulders unguarded, the particular absence of the watchfulness he'd carried all year. She had gotten good, over 11 months, at reading the difference between Harry at ease and Harry holding himself carefully in the shape of ease. This was the first thing. She turned back to her book. She had 3 months before September. She had a list. Of course she had a list. She'd had it since April, of everything she wanted to read before year 2 began. The list was annotated. There were secondary lists. She had, in the back seat of her parents' car, asleep with his mouth slightly open and his glasses slightly crooked, and no visible awareness that any of this was remarkable. A brother. She turned a page. Outside, England went past in all its ordinary summer abundance, and the car went home, and Harry slept,